Welcome. I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the Policy Director at Defense Priorities. We're here today to talk about nuclear deterrence. The title is New York for Paris, NATO and Extended Deterrence in the New Nuclear Age. And what we really want to talk about is the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. In the Cold War, there was a great deal of attention paid to the credibility or believability of U.S. nuclear threats. Famous books like Thomas Schelling's Arms and Influence were written about this problem of how do you threaten to defend someone if it means potentially committing suicide in an age of mutually assured destruction. Now, I don't think we've forgotten entirely about the nuclear threats underlying NATO and other U.S. alliances. But they're much less prominently discussed. And we've expanded NATO, of course. I think we now have 32 members. And the question arises, how credible are the nuclear threats underlying NATO? Do we have a credibility problem? Is U.S. nuclear weapons policy still succeeding? Is it making excessive threats or does it rely on excessively dangerous arsenal? So we have an excellent panel here to discuss that today. We have Jason Castillo, who is a non-resident fellow at Defense Priorities and a associate professor at Texas A&M University. We have Ariel Petrovich, who's a fellow at, or assistant research scholar, I should say, at the University of Maryland, and doing research focused on this topic. And we potentially have a third panelist, Eric Gartsky, who is hung up in some sort of problem in Asia, where he's supposed to be joining us from. But we're going to proceed regardless. So we'll have each panelist talk for about 3 to 5 minutes. Maybe, if you feel like going a little longer, that's fine. And then we'll just take it away with discussion. So with that, Jason, you're up first.
Thanks for the invitation, and happy to share my evolving views. And selfishly, this helps with a book project I'm working on the dangers of extended nuclear deterrence. I think the answer to the question about the credibility of our current deterrent today, especially when we think about Europe, we should go back to the Cold War and recognize that in the Cold War, really at the beginning of World War II, we had a decision to make about, at the end of World War II, we had a decision to make about how we were going to prevent a Eurasian hegemon in Europe. And after all, that was why we went to war to begin with to stop Nazi Germany from becoming a Eurasian hegemon. And at the end of World War II, we had to decide whether we were going to go home, raise a large conventional force to protect our half of Europe and later the NATO alliance, or rely on nuclear weapons. And of course, we all know the story that we relied on nuclear weapons because we didn't want to have a large conventional army permanently in Europe, even though eventually we did have a large conventional army permanently in Europe. And so we relied on nuclear weapons. And that made some sense early on in the Cold War because we had a nuclear monopoly. But by 1949, that nuclear monopoly is broken, but we still have nuclear superiority. In the Truman administration, and later articulated more forcefully and clearly in the Eisenhower administration, we had a policy of massive retaliation. That is, we would respond massively to an attack conventionally with nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies. This policy of massive retaliation didn't look credible, especially when the Soviets acquired the capability to hold not just European targets at risk, but to respond in kind to the continental United States, illustrated by or punctuated by Sputnik, where Soviet ICBMs we now knew could reach the United States. So we entered an extreme phase of mutual vulnerability. We went from a nuclear monopoly to nuclear superiority to nuclear parity, what some people would call the most extreme version of mutual vulnerability, mutually assured destruction. And there, we pursued a policy of flexible response. So flexible response is an effort to come up with options to use nuclear weapons first credibly, should conventional deterrence fail. So what you're seeing over time in the Cold War is an evolution of how we consider nuclear deterrence. First, it was threats to impose costs, that is, target Soviet cities. And then in the Eisenhower era, we maintained that threat and massive retaliation, but we also used that superiority to threaten to take away the Soviet nuclear arsenal, that is, through counterforce targeting, so-called damage limitation attacks. And then the recognition early on, from McNamara to the end of the Cold War, that we'd love to do damage limitation, but it's going to be really hard against a nuclear peer. And as a result, we pursued a strategy of flexible response. It's hard to nail down the definition of flexible response, but essentially it means you use nuclear weapons, or nuclear deterrence works by threatening to deny the war aims of your adversary. And so you can envision an escalation ladder somewhere between doing nothing and mutual death. We need a bunch of coercive options to deny Soviet war aims. And part of flexible response, ironically, was bolstering conventional deterrence, but also introducing and rationalizing theater nuclear forces, that is, weapons used on the battlefield or used in Europe. It would be connected to our strategic nuclear forces. And the theory of flexible response is that you prevail through escalation and dominance. The other side cries uncle, keep the war limited, everyone returns to the status quo ante. Happily, we never tested these theories. It was good for the environment, bad for social science, because we don't know what makes nuclear deterrence work. The Cold War ends, we expand NATO. These kinds of debates fall into the historical archives. A lot of the people who trained me at the RAND Corporation either retired or passed away. And now they've returned to the forefront. And I think the first sign of it was the Trump 2018 nuclear posture review that called for new nuclear capabilities. And the concern today is, in places like Europe, we've expanded the alliance, and we did that without really thinking concretely about what the cost and the risk of extended deterrence were. And the scenario that worried us is, and still worries us, is that Russia might attempt a fait accompli somewhere along NATO's eastern flank. Russia sees nuclear weapons like we saw nuclear weapons during the Cold War. They pursue escalate to de-escalate, which is a synonym for flexible response. NATO would prevail in a conventional fight against Russia, and then Russia would escalate, and we'd be off to the races. And we would be in this realm of flexible response. So I think, without getting into further details, and I'm hoping that we can do this in the Q&A, that if you look at NATO's capabilities, you look at US capabilities, and you try to match them up with what we say is required for nuclear deterrence, in this environment where we're conventionally superior, and it's out of Russian conventional weakness that they would escalate, that we have a real challenge upon us. It's a different challenge in the Cold War. In the Cold War, the challenge was making nuclear threats to deter a conventional invasion. And today, it's making nuclear threats to deter nuclear use should Russia or China or North Korea start to lose in a conventional conflict. And when I look at basically the two kinds of logics guiding US nuclear policy, I see two problems. First, I'm not sure we have the capabilities to pursue the exotic strategies we think undergird deterrence. And second, I don't think they're going to work. And I don't think people have considered the dangers associated with them.
All right, thanks, Jason. Ariel, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason, for the background on that. Also, I look forward to the book project when it comes out. I'm going to sort of add a little bit to that and try and sort of tie it into other nuclear issues that we see going on globally as well, but thinking a lot about sort of force structure, force posture. And that basically just means that the way that different countries, including the US, have their different capabilities arrayed around the possible theater. And then that's sort of how they're structured. And then also their postures, basically how they claim they would then therefore use them. So a little bit of background on the NATO force structure, force posture, specifically nuclear, since that's obviously what we're focusing on today. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France are the only countries in NATO that have nuclear weapons. In fact, they're the only ones that are actually allowed to have nuclear weapons. So that's part of international treaties. That's been recognized for a long time. They're part of the P5 or permanent 5 that are actually permitted to have nuclear capabilities. That said, the United States is actually the only one that has capabilities that match at every level of that ladder that Jason was describing, including, but not limited to, the strategic weapons, in other words, the really, really big ones that could match Russian capabilities. So that's obviously meant that the United States has then borne the burden, the lion's share of the burden of basically any sort of nuclear posture and nuclear deterrence. However, NATO is sort of a unique situation in which they claim that they have a shared nuclear policy. That's kind of imprecise because it is actually not possible for the United States or any nuclear country to share actual access and launch capabilities of their nuclear weapons with anyone else. So that means that if Poland decided they wanted to launch nuclear weapons, it would still be on the US in order to actually pull that trigger. That is sort of part of the nuclear command and control structure. It's sort of part of nuclear safety and security, and it's necessary. But that means that sort of what does it really mean to have a shared nuclear posture, a shared nuclear policy? What it's meant in theory, and has never obviously been put to the test of practice. We've never actually had a nuclear war in Europe. This has meant that supposedly the leaders, both in theater and most importantly, the government leaders of each of the different member states coordinate on any sort of nuclear response. That means what they're going to say in response to possible threats, and then conceivably what they would actually do, again, although that's never been truly put to the test. Although obviously we have actually tested whether or not they're going to coordinate what they say, and they don't always. France, for example, came under pressure a few years ago for saying that it probably would not launch nuclear weapons against Russia if it were to use its force in Ukraine, because France's nuclear posture specifically says, its doctrine says, that it will only use nuclear weapons in extreme cases of self-defense, and its vital interest would not be threatened in Ukraine. Now, that's changed recently because now Macron has also said that it would like to offer nuclear extended deterrence, basically put NATO under its own nuclear umbrella as well. So there's sort of two sides to that. Sort of, what does everyone say? Are they truly coordinated in what they're saying and what they would therefore do? And then do their statements over time line up? So are they offering sort of a credible, reliable nuclear posture? It's something that both allies and adversaries would see as something that they can rely on. They know that if some strong threat would to come forward to NATO, NATO would respond as a unified front in kind. And that's sort of been the theme or the MO of the shared nuclear policy all the way through. So a little bit sort of now looking today at NATO's nuclear force posture and its sort of the statements that we see coming through. As the title of this talk implies, one of the things that is sort of motivating these questions right now is Macron's recent statement. So New York for Paris, would the US come to NATO's aid? But there's also the question right there of Paris. How would Paris respond if there were threats that came forward to NATO? And so all of the different nuclear armed allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, hypothetically, and according to the NATO's own doctrines, they would all sort of propose a unified front. They would lend their own capabilities to defend every part of NATO as if it were their own. So in other words, the farthest reaches of NATO, the United States would hypothetically defend as if it were part of U.S. homeland. So with everything that they have that they would be able to bring to bear. The reason that is important is because part of that extended deterrence that Jason was describing is that the United States and the other nuclear armed countries, but also the rest of NATO, has to be able to convince adversaries or potential adversaries that they would come to one another's aid with plenty of force, enough that it would actually change their adversary's mind about coming in the first place. So in other words, deter the attack from even beginning. The reason why that's so important is obviously because as soon as the nuclear weapons are launched, then we have a nuclear war. And so deterrence is potentially no longer going to be as useful. That's something that the United States claims, right? Once nuclear weapons are launched, it's a nuclear war. And so it's sort of beyond the scope of conventional capabilities. And the US considers any nuclear weapon then therefore fair game. That's sort of part of our deterrence and the United States sort of doctrine. That's not the case in Russia. And Russia, obviously right now, is NATO's biggest adversary and sort of the most current threat. According to Russia's nuclear doctrine, in other words, the way they say they would use their weapons, is that they have an escalate to de-escalate strategy. So that basically means they could escalate a little bit, sort of use some small nuclear weapons. We usually call them low yield or tactical nuclear weapons. And they're much smaller. They can be used in a battlefield and they wouldn't take out all of, let's say, Paris. They could be used in a smaller, much more contained area. But they're still nuclear. That means they have radioactive fallout. That means the area there would be radioactive for a long time. You have large risk of civilian casualties still, even if it is harder to control, and you do have sort of those long-term damage that you need to sort of worry about. The reason why this is a problem, sort of this mismatch between the two major adversaries' nuclear doctrines, is that if one country thinks that nuclear weapons are fair game, you can use small ones, and if they're limited in terms of their damage and they're used largely in battlefield situations rather than on civilians, and then that makes them fair game. And the major adversary says once it's nuclear, it's game over. There's obviously risks for a sort of a blow-up conflict. And NATO, their posture has been, and the basically posture meaning the way that they say they'd use their nuclear weapons, but also where their nuclear weapons are placed and what kind of weapons. Are they really big ones or low yield? Are they placed on airplanes that are sort of circling all the time? Or are they placed in silos? And all of this sort of lends the idea that NATO doesn't have a very precise nuclear doctrine, and that's been intentional. In fact, even the former president of France kind of came down on Macron for saying that he wouldn't use nuclear weapons against Russia if it used them in Ukraine a couple of years ago, saying that basically being vague is one of the primary ways in which NATO keeps itself safe. So it is intentional that it will not say explicitly, we will use nuclear weapons in this situation and not in this other one, because it basically lends itself to sort of a red line which would potentially allow adversaries to sort of creep up to, but not over that supposed red line, which allows, so then therefore maybe nuclear weapons wouldn't be as credible of a deterrence and they wouldn't work as well. So this has all sort of led to a little bit of question for today: who would be able to actually deter Russia if it were to continue to sort of threaten with nuclear weapons? And if it were to consider using its nuclear weapons, what would then NATO do in response? As I've said, the United States, sort of their nuclear weapons have been the primary article of NATO nuclear, sort of their shared nuclear policies. But France has been claiming recently that they would like to then extend their own umbrella. This goes towards what Trump and even Obama before that had asked of its NATO partners, that maybe they step up a little bit more to the plate, do a little bit more for the burden sharing of NATO, so that it's not just a United States umbrella over everybody. But it also means that now the allies in NATO need to wonder whether or not France would actually be willing to trade Paris for example, Helsinki. So we're obviously talking here about New York for Paris, but there's also the questions of Paris for somewhere else, or if the UK were to make a similar statement, London for somewhere else. And then it lends itself to the question of how far is that somewhere else, right? It's potentially credible that Paris would be willing to come to Germany's aid, for example. They're right there on the border. They have a lot of shared interests and a long shared history. Because of proximity, obviously a nuclear threat to Germany could potentially be a threat to France. And so we could see definitely France wanting to come to Germany's aid. But would France also want to come to Poland's aid? Would it also want to come to the aid of the Baltic states? How far are we willing to sort of extend these boundaries? And does that then start eroding at the credibility of all for one and one for all? So I'm mostly teeing these up here so that we can hopefully talk about them all together. But hopefully that provides a little bit of background on sort of what is NATO's nuclear force structure, how do their doctrines, in other words, what they say, line up with what they're actually doing, and what are some of the current threats that we might see coming towards NATO today.
Terrific. Thank you both. For the first question, what I'd like to talk about is damage limitation and counterforce, which are almost but not quite the same thing. Maybe Jason, you could start, or you can pick it up, but just to discuss, how did damage limitation become so important to U.S. nuclear doctrine and to the question of credibility? And as a follow-on, is it still the U.S. policy that in the event of I'm going to assert here, skipping over a lot of detail, that it was the policy in the Cold War, and in the event of a conventional war with Russia or their invasion of NATO territory, are we still planning on a massive nuclear strike to basically denude the Russians of their nuclear capability, a damage limitation or counterforce strike? So I hope that's clear. Let me know if it's not, but please proceed.
So the way I explain this when I'm on an airplane and I make the mistake of talking about my research is that in the Cold War, we made three kinds of threats with nuclear weapons. The first was impose costs, a punishment campaign. And that made sense when you were in a nuclear monopoly. And then in the Eisenhower era, when the Soviets break the monopoly, damage limitation becomes important. And it becomes important because who is in the crosshairs of Soviet nuclear retaliatory capability? It is our European allies. And so the articulated strategy of massive retaliation indicated we can still impose costs, but we can limit damage to Europe. And that bolstered the credibility or the idea, the plausibility that we could use nuclear weapons first to stop this kind of invasion. Fast forward to nuclear parity, you get a strategy of flexible response. The strategy of flexible response says we're not sanguine about damage limitation anymore. And as a result, we need options. Now, the way I look at it, having worked on these issues in government and as an academic, the damage limitation option still exists. You know, it's sort of the Tony Soprano's clipping the guy is still an option. It's not an attractive option because, as the nuclear revolution folks remind us, these things are going to hurt even when you attempt to limit damage. So I think we still pursue damage limitation, and I don't find many people in government optimistic about it. And their views of damage limitation are essentially, you might need it for a very bad day. The preferred course is having these options so you can really engage in a limited nuclear war. Think of it as coercive bargaining, where you're trying to achieve escalation and dominance. Let's say Russia uses one nuclear weapon, you respond in a way so they stop using nuclear weapons. That's basically the theory of flexible response as articulated throughout the Cold War. It remains our strategy. I'm not saying it's a good theory. In fact, I think it's a bad theory, but that's where the whole strategy rests. So in summary, yes, damage limitation, I still think is something we pursue. It's still something we think about, but I don't think of it as the first option in responding to adversary nuclear use.
Ariel, do you have an addition?
Yeah, I'm mostly going to say that I think Jason kind of nailed it on this one. It's basically you can think of them as different competing mentalities towards a nuclear doctrine, but they aren't actually competing, right? In many ways, they are potentially complement one another, right? Damage limitation does not mean you can't have a flexible response, and flexible response doesn't mean you wouldn't necessarily pursue damage limitation. It's the reason why we think about things like counterforce when we're talking about damage limitation is that we want to not only limit the damage that we could potentially have on U.S. targets, but do so by also eliminating adversary capabilities of pursuing greater conflict in the future. So counterforce would basically mean that we would be destroying their ability to bring force to bear on the U.S. In reality, we probably actually practice a little bit of all of them, or would theoretically. Again, we haven't really had this tested, luckily. So counterforce would be destroying military targets. If we're talking about Russia as the primary target, destroying Russian military targets so that it couldn't bring greater force to bear in the future. But countervalue doesn't mean that we wouldn't actually use countervalue. So countervalue would be things like economic centers or population centers. That being said, obviously, the United States and many other countries do believe that we should be avoiding things like civilian casualties. So we would be looking more at things like, would it be destroying bridges, or would it be destroying, potentially like economic centers, but limiting, human problems. This is where, and nuclear weapons, I should mention, nuclear weapons are not solely used as something like, a big boom with a lot of radioactive fallout on people. One of the big potential threats of nuclear weapons is they can be used as basically an electromagnetic pulse. So they can be used to basically wipe out things like, Wi-Fi and communications in a large area if you detonate them in the atmosphere. There's a lot of other bad things that happen if you detonate them in the atmosphere. So it's not like you can sort of do this willy-nilly and just be like, oh, we're just going to give them a blackout for a little while. You also have a lot of radioactive fallout. It's sort of very dangerous for other reasons. But nuclear weapons have uses beyond just sort of burning up places or people or things. They can also sort of burn up methods of communication as well. So that's where you can get towards things like countervalue without even maybe being lethal in any way.
It's a hard idea to wrap your head around. Jason, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on one thing that Ariel said that's important. My sense is that policymakers believe that these flexible options and damage limitation are complementary in a sense. My worry is that they are not. And this is why I am pessimistic about controlling escalation once it starts, which is the requirement for flexible response to work, for us to prevail, is to keep escalation under control or managed. That's the preferred word. My concern is the pressure to limit damage will undermine flexible response. That is, you will have people saying, how many rounds of exchanges are we going to go through before we start to protect American lives? Because we can't trust that this is going to stop or that they can control their own nuclear forces. So I think that is an internal contradiction of flexible response that its proponents either don't recognize or are afraid to admit.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem, I'm going to talk a little more than I otherwise would since we're short of panelists. It does seem hard to imagine that you can take the sort of terror out of nuclear war and that that would, be a good thing. It seems sort of important that it be very terrible for the deterrent effects. But so you get into these theories and it becomes more complicated. Let me pose a question that's somewhat oversimplified to both of you. Some research I did in the past on the Cold War led me to this way of looking at things, which is oversimplified, but I think a valid perspective, which is the United States in the beginning of the Cold War, the mid-Cold War, had a terrible, once we were in a mutually assured destruction world, MAD, the United States had a impossible problem to solve, which is that we had to threaten to defend Germany, a country that not so long ago we've been at war with, at risk of suicide. We had to trade New York for Berlin or what have you. And there was really no getting around that. That's what MAD means. Damage limitation and counterforce targeting and the sort of promises that were made by increased accuracy of really the whole arsenal, but particularly ICBMs, operated, and here's the controversial part, is a very sophisticated bluff to basically convince observers that the United States really believed that we could fight a nuclear war, that we could take out enough Soviet counter-strike capability, which is to say, remove enough dead Americans and burning cities from the equation, that we really might defend Germany, that we were serious. And even if the Soviets didn't quite buy it, you know, if they really looked at the situation hard, or an objective observer did, and they said, you know, when the day comes when the tanks roll into Berlin or maybe beyond to West Germany proper, are they really going to do this? You know, they say they're going to do damage limitation and they have all this doctrine, but you know, when it really comes time to press the button, are they really going to do it? Probably not. But that's not good enough. That's not good enough, you know, because if you think, oh, there's a 10% chance that I'm destroying the world by invading Berlin, right? You're not going to do it because the consequences are so high. So what is it valid, as I'm asserting, to think, you know, this was all kind of a big bluff, and, you know, if US, you know, this was all just a way of thinking about the unthinkable and doing the undoable by having this doctrine on paper.
Ariel, you want to go for this one?
Yeah, this one's actually, I think, an interesting question. Sort of, how do you make extended deterrence credible? In other words, how do you say that my umbrella is going to cover you, and if my ass is on the line, I'm not going to yank that umbrella back away so that it's covered? That's something that the U.S. has had to sort of grapple with in a number of theaters for a long time. It obviously started with NATO, but we have similar agreements now with Japan and South Korea. They were sort of part of the nuclear nonproliferation effort that we had in both of those countries, especially South Korea. That one's been called into question more and more. You know, it's a particularly important one given that they are now facing a nuclear armed adversary on their border. So how has the U.S. Done that? There have been a couple of different ways. Some of them is sort of damage limitation, right? We can actually execute a war without putting ourselves at so much risk, so that we are not talking about a trade-off between Washington and Berlin, for example. Another one is trying to make it credible that we think it is so important that we protect Berlin, or we protect, you know, in the case of South Korea, right? We're going to protect Seoul, that we are going to put our own capabilities and, more importantly, our own people in harm's way. We call them tripwires, but basically have forward deployed people and weapons that basically say, look, if you come across and try and take over these NATO countries, and we had forward deployed weapons in Poland for a long time. We had them in Turkey during the Cold War. And that was sort of part of the way that we tried to demonstrate that we were willing to really come to these allies' aids. If, for example, you know, Soviet tanks were to have rolled over into Poland, they would have encountered U.S. nuclear weapons and U.S. personnel manning those weapons. So that was one way in which the United States tried to make it credible. Obviously, I'm going to go ahead and highlight there's a huge risk that comes with that. A tripwire, as it is intended to do, could potentially actually draw the United States into an all-out war because of a border skirmish, right? And an all-out war between two nuclear-armed countries is something that basically, you know, these nuclear weapons in part were invented in order to prevent that from actually happening, right? It would be so horrible for the United States and now Russia to come in conflict with each other directly in a way that could risk escalating, that they basically avoid doing it entirely, right? We did almost all of our conflict with the Soviet Union throughout an entire almost 50-year conflict with the Soviet Union. We conducted it almost exclusively in proxy wars. That should be telling that nuclear war is something that everybody really does want to avoid. It is not good for anyone. But the way that you try to avoid it might be sort of risking that you actually do it. So things like tripwires are how we've tried to prevent conflict or, you know, any sort of risk to our allies on the borders. But they could actually involve tripping the wire and bringing the United States into conflict. So all of these tactics have risks.
Okay.
Let me jump in here and just say, I want to say three things to your question about the pursuit of damage limitation. It does seem fantastical that we would try to do this, especially against a near peer. right? And I think we realized that in the Cold War, that if you're in MAD, it's going to be really hard to break out. So why did we do it? And I think the central issue is we just don't know what makes extended nuclear deterrence works. We don't know how to overcome this credibility problem. So flexible response is kind of like Goldilocks. We want it all. And even so, there are two uncertainties that undergird all of this. The first is every Secretary of Defense from McNamara to the end of the Cold War said two things that are contradictory, that we could prevail, but we couldn't control escalation. And Schlesinger at least admits in his memoirs that he did that on purpose because it made it sound really scary. The second thing, and this is to bring it to today, I used to give talks at the NATO Defense College until I irritated them recently by pointing out that their thinking about nuclear weapons is kind of outdated. And I reminded them that they never had to resolve some tensions in flexible response regarding NATO's nuclear doctrine. Here's the contradiction, or the tension. The European views about nuclear employment was that it was going to be early in a conflict, it was going to be for demonstration purposes, and it was going to be over there. The American view was it's going to be late, because why did we build all these conventional forces? It's going to be in West Germany, and it's going to be massive to change the balance of power on the battlefield. And we never tested that. We never resolved that. And sadly, I don't even think NATO is thinking in those terms. One reason they might not be thinking in those terms is because NATO's nuclear response, the capabilities we share with them, basically rest on dual capable F-35s and their ability to penetrate Russian air defenses and use gravity bombs. And I don't think many people believe that unless you get a few drinks into them.
Well, just to elaborate on that, I mean, let's talk more about the details of extended deterrence these days, but let's start with those gravity bombs. I mean, it seems to me in personal experience that the Germans, at least, are sort of two minds about this. You know, there's a fair amount of sentiment. I mean, who isn't? But there's a fair amount of sentiment that's anti-nukes, and you know, they'd like to get tactical nukes out of Europe, out of their area. But at the same time, they're worried about what it would say about U.S. commitment to extended deterrence to NATO in the event that we yanked all those nukes, as people, I think, including me, a few times have recommended. So, I mean, how important or increasingly irrelevant, or what are these tactical nuclear weapons that we still have in, I forget how many European countries?
Well, my own view on theater, I like to break up forces in theater between the intermediate range and the battlefield ones. Okay. And I think most proponents of flexible response today, and that is the prevailing view, I think, in defense circles, is they don't really want to have that conversation. And they would prefer to talk about conventional alternatives and missile defenses. And then if you press them on, yes, but we don't think the F-35 is really great for flexible response, then you'll get, well, we have the submarine launch ballistic missile that is variable yield, the 76-2. That's a weapon that you can use low yield, that can be tactical, and it can penetrate the air defense. And then you'll get people who advocate the SLCM-N, the submarine launched cruise missile that's nuclear, that the Biden administration doesn't want, but I think a Trump administration would probably deploy. And these are all efforts to deal with the kind of conventional conflict where Russia might use nuclear weapons because it's losing. My own personal view is that if you're an Eastern flank NATO country, then you're probably those capabilities will probably be insufficient. And that you might want things like the new Pershing II, or you might want your army maneuver units to have battlefield nuclear weapons.
Wait, sorry to interrupt. What's the case for a submarine launched cruise missile versus submarine launched ballistic missile?
We're getting into tricky business here, but I think overall, the concern with the 76-2 is that there's a higher risk of inadvertent escalation because you can't tell if it's a prompt counterforce weapon that's meant to disarm, or if it's a genteel response that's consistent with the Marquis de Queensberry rules of limited nuclear war. You just can't tell. I mean, it gets back to your original point, which is counterforce is mostly for damage limitation until it's not. And both capabilities have counterforce in them, and it puts the adversary in the position of having to understand why this SLBM is coming in my direction. Is this the beginning of a first strike to disarm me, or is this a part of the duel that we're fighting?
Yeah. Ariel, did you have a comment on the utility or irrelevance of TAC nukes in Europe?
Yeah, that's the ability to distinguish is really important. In fact, that's one of the things that the United States has said about that's risky about Russia's strategy, right? If you see that nuclear weapons are being deployed, forward deployed in a conflict, it's hard to know if that's going to be for sort of this the duel, as Jason described it, something sort of limited and within range, or if this is going to be part of sort of a first mover advantage, the sort of incentive that everybody has to try and smack the other one down before they can do anything too big. And if you see something coming at you and you can't tell if it's going to be really big or if it's just going to be limited, you're going to have to assume that it's going to be really big. Because otherwise you might sustain that really big attack. You might be forced to sustain a big attack and then respond, rather than, I mean, ideally, sort of knocking it out of the sky first, or maybe even preventing it from launching on the ground. You get these incentives for a first mover advantage that can become really dangerous, because then you're starting to get into each adversary needs to know what the other one's actually thinking, and that's never going to happen.
When we get into these technical questions and we start to talk about the rationales for different delivery systems and so forth, I have a hard time believing the sort of official arguments, which seem to rely on these. I mean, they're usually logical enough, but they seem to rely on these kind of fine-grained distinctions. And the question, I guess, is what's the historical basis for that? If we look at, how states, the United States and the Soviet Union primarily, make decisions in crises and with a lot on the line, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth. I mean, do you think they behave like, RAND scholars in war game scenarios or game theorists, or is it more of a blunt kind of analysis? It is a loaded question, but take it as you will.
Well, I guess I'll just say that it seems unlikely, and based on sort of the luckily relatively limited past experience that we've had with these kinds of nuclear crises, it basically depends on who you have sitting in that chair at that moment and how well rested they are that day, for example, right? They're still humans that are trying to make calculations with very limited information, and recognizing that there may be a lot at stake, and they may not want to take the potentially more nuanced option because it could involve more risk. So we know that JFK received a lot of pushback, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to act now, act quickly, because we're going to lose that window. And it's very possible the Cuban Missile Crisis could have turned out very differently had he done so. So we did come out the other side of the Cuban Missile Crisis, luckily, without starting a nuclear war, but we shouldn't take that for granted. That doesn't mean that it was predestined that we wouldn't have had a nuclear war in that scenario.
Yeah. Jason,
the interesting thing about nuclear weapons is it focuses the mind on what matters more, technology or politics. And I don't buy all the precepts of the nuclear revolution, but the one that I buy is that if these things land on you, it's going to hurt. And so I don't trust sophisticated technological gizmos to disarm the adversary completely, so I can be cavalier about the use of force against a nuclear armed power. I know people who think that I'm a lefty peacenik for believing that, but I have a healthy respect for the damage nuclear weapons can do.
Yeah. Well, it does seem certainly fair to say, as Ariel did, that if you had somebody else in the big chair, you might get different decisions, but also that the people who were in charge of the Soviet Union and the United States, for the most part, seem to be more in the camp of like, geez, I don't know, wars tend to get out of control. And, we're not really interested in testing what nuclear superiority does for us that much. I wanted to be focused more on policy, though. So you both, in your remarks, opening remarks, talked a bit about the problems of extended deterrence now. The discussion question for this panel got into mentioned this, with NATO having 32 members. I mean, how credible is U.S. extended deterrence? I know you both touched on this already, but I want to give you a chance to elaborate. How credible is extended deterrence today, extended by the United States? And what are the problems to the extent it isn't?
Jason, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So the way I think about this, my framework for thinking about this is I think about the military missions we want nuclear weapons to deter. And so on most military missions, the U.S. nuclear arsenal is adequate, deterring nuclear attacks out of the blue against the American homeland. I think we got that covered. It's important to isolate what missions you think nuclear weapons cover. Our nuclear arsenal does not deter Russia from invading Ukraine, nor was it ever intended for that. And that's a mistake that I think people make. The hardest mission, and this is why I'm pessimistic about the credibility of our deterrent, the hardest mission we face is pushing a Russian incursion out of NATO's eastern flank. I think we will prevail in that, not just because of poor Russian performance in Ukraine, but in general, I think NATO would prevail. And the danger with that, and this is my summer class where I teach scientists from the different labs about nuclear deterrence, we're going to come up with t-shirts that say, you win and then they escalate. So we would prevail conventionally, and they would be in the same position we were in the Cold War, which is they don't want to lose a high stakes conventional conflict. And so they use nuclear weapons. And I think that is the hardest thing for us to deter. It's almost mission impossible to think that under those circumstances, you could deter nuclear attacks against successful American conventional force.
I think that was an excellent answer. I really like the you win and then they escalate. That's sort of it's really sort of where do you draw the line, and how much is each side willing to risk. When we talk about Russia as the our primary adversary here of interest, we know from past experience that Russia is willing to risk a lot. They've done it many times. That's probably actually why they were able to be so successful in both of the world wars. It wasn't because they had fewer casualties than any other side. They had more. It wasn't because they sustained less damage. They just kept doing it anyways. So we know that Russia's willing to go through a lot if it's something that they consider very, very important to their domestic interests. And I think one thing that sort of tends to get lost in a lot of the banter about Russia is we talk about Putin, right? We only talk about Putin. And there's a reason for that, right? Putin has been in power for a long time. And while he's not a personalist autocrat, he is a leader of a very powerful oligarchy. He's kind of starting to sort of verge on being a personalist autocrat. In other words, meaning that there's so much power collected in him on his own that he might be able to make choices unilaterally that others in powerful positions might not even have chosen, and be able to just do it. But that doesn't mean that the Russian people have no play here. That sounds like maybe it could be a good thing, right? That the domestic audiences in Russia would say, hey, we don't really want to escalate too much. Maybe we want to be more moderated, but that's not necessarily how it would play out. Putin may have a lot of incentives individually for, sort of continuing a conflict, but he probably also is going to face a lot of incentives to not take a bad deal. So he can't seem domestically like he's sort of back down in the face of Washington's aggression, for example. If that's the narrative that he is sort of painted into, he's going to continue to push back because he just can't afford to look that weak. there's reasons why, he's got pictures of himself, shirtless on horseback and stuff. It's not because he, looking strong is not important to him. So it's not just sort of a personal thing. He wants to look strong. This is part of the way he has maintained power. So there are sort of political reasons why Russia couldn't take what would look like a bad deal. So it's possible that extended deterrence could do exactly what we think it would, we would like it to do, in that it would potentially prevent sort of, for example, an attack on Washington directly. As Jason said, it's probably done that. I mean, we don't know that for sure because it hasn't happened. It's impossible to prove the counterfactual, but it certainly looks like it's done a pretty good job of that. What it hasn't done and may not be able to do in this kind of conflict is prevent the conventional conflict from continuing to escalate. And we know this, again, sounds like a good thing. We know that Washington, and especially Washington plus NATO and Ukraine, probably conventionally outmatches Russia. But that may not always be a really good thing, because if we can smash them conventionally and they can't accept true defeat, then they may have incentives to keep moving to nuclear, even if it's just a small step to nuclear. And that, as part of the gamble that, well, it's small enough that the United States would think that it's, they're not going to respond in kind. But again, it's a gamble there. You don't know. And whoever's sitting in the chair at that time, not just whoever's sitting in Washington in the White House, but whoever is sitting in the battlefield, sort of making those kinds of decisions when they have launch authority. Sort of, in other words, if you've gotten to a tripwire situation and the policy is, if you see a massive weapon coming at you, you are allowed to respond, or at least try and take it out of the sky. Now you have things that can escalate really quickly.
Ariel, you brought up in your remarks the prospect or idea of French extended deterrence. I guess we could talk about British extended deterrence too. Those are the two other arsenals in NATO. Is that possible? Is the problem capability, or is the problem, political will, or what? Why is it so radioactive, to use a fun term in the United States?
Yeah,
bring up that idea.
I would say take your pick. Right, it's both. Both France and the UK have intentionally sort of limited nuclear arsenals. Nothing on the order of, and they haven't pursued anything on the order of what the US and Russia have. That's been sort of intentional choices on their part. For example, the UK basically relies on a sea-based fleet, and they have effectively no land-based nuclear capabilities. In other words, that means they would have, they would need to build stuff if they wanted to be able to forward deploy, for example, ICBMs into sort of mainland Europe. They can't do it right now. France has some land-based stuff, but it's nothing like what the United States does. They have very limited arsenals. Some argue that's all you need. It's probably all you need if what you wanted to have was a sure second strike for your own homeland. In other words, if you wanted to deter an adversary from launching a nuclear weapon at France homeland, they probably only need enough that they can have some hidden where they would be able to respond with some kind of really big, maybe strategic, but something large in kind. That's not all you need if what you want is a flexible response. Again, I'm saying if what you want is a flexible response. I don't know if that's always the best option. But if what the NATO leaders are looking for is a flexible response, they're going to be relying on US weapons. There's sort of no way around it. And mainland Europe, especially more Eastern Europe, they've already said that they wouldn't trust the ability or willingness of London or Paris to come to their aid in a conflict. Some say they may question, whether the U.S. would do so unless it had forward deployed weapons. That's been one of the reasons why, sort of Poland demanded it for a while. It's definitely one of the things that's been sparking some discussion. And another theater, if we want to talk about South Korea as well, they've also asked for forward deployed U.S. weapons, and it's partly because they would maybe even need that from the U.S. to trust it. But there's sort of no question that other allies don't really trust that France or the U.K. would be able to or willing to do so.
Jason, did you have anything to add on this, or
I largely agree. And I think, we talked about the frontline state that could go nuclear here, and that's Germany. And if I were advising the Germans, I would advise them to go nuclear if they had doubts about the U.S. Deterrent. And to tie a bow around this whole conversation, I think we all agree we don't know how extended deterrence works. And the U.S. puts itself in danger in order to make it credible. And so we probably want to be more accepting of our allies who go nuclear, because then it reduces the burden for us on extended nuclear deterrence.
Yeah. And well, speaking of bow tying, we have 5 minutes left. So this is, I guess, a good time to ask for recommendations you have, either to solve or mitigate U.S. extended deterrence problems, credibility gaps, or to somehow give up on doing that and be more realistic. Any policy recommendations here for us in bullet point form before we go? Jason, you can go first.
I think for me, an interesting policy recommendation is that if you're going to expand NATO, which I have never been in favor of, and we keep doing, I think saying that is why I don't get invited to nice meetings in Rome to enjoy the Italian cuisine. If you're going to expand NATO, then you have to expand the commensurate conventional capabilities to deal with these problems. And so in other words, you got to bolster conventional deterrence if you're worried about these dangers of extended deterrence and escalation. And when I look at Russia, they've been in the crucible of war, and I can see that blitzkrieg is too hard for them. This is not the Red Army of 1983, and they're good at attrition wars, but I'm not sure they want to fight an attrition war against the United States. So it's really a limited aim strategy, fight and hold, fait accomplis, places in the Baltics where NATO might have to operate conventionally. And that has a wicked implication for NATO, which means it's going to have to bolster its conventional deterrent for forward defense along a long line of real estate. And forward defense is the best way to solve this problem, but it's also very costly. And I'm not sure other NATO allies, including the United States, want to bear that cost. So my recommendation is bolster conventional deterrence.
You didn't even mention the 800 miles of border, roughly, that we just added vis-a-vis Finland.
Yep.
I think roughly doubling the NATO border with Russia, which could arguably is a sort of a bill waiting to be paid by somebody in the alliance down the road. Ariel, do you have policy recommendations?
Yeah, I'm not going to touch too much on the NATO expansion. I think it's all been said already. I mean, I wouldn't be adding anything by saying expanding NATO, and especially promising to expand NATO and then not doing it are very risky strategies, right? NATO was originally made to supposedly balance against Russia. So bringing it right up to, or the Soviet Union at that time, bringing it right up to Russia's doorstep, including some of the former Soviet states, is potentially asking for a problem. But what I will say is that as Jason described at the very beginning of this talk, those rungs on the escalation ladder are the ways that we can ideally maybe deter conflict, but they can also be used to inadvertently continue to escalate. If it's a really small step from rung 3 to rung 4 and rung 4 to rung 5, it becomes easier and easier to climb that escalation ladder. That's not saying we want to potentially take a big jump, get rid of lines 3, 4, 5, and you have to jump all the way up to 7, right? But if you have a really big gap there, it can limit the escalation risks. And so, I've said this before, I've written about this. I do think that low yield weapons are a potentially very risky thing to have, certainly a risky thing to have forward deployed and sort of right up on the border with a country that says they want to use low yield weapons. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons why some experts have argued that we should have them, right? We should match in kind, but there are definitely reasons why we want to be able to credibly say the US thinks that nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons and they are bad. And they are so risky that we don't want any conflict to go that far. That's sort of in line with what Jason was saying about sort of bolster conventional deterrence. If you have conventional capabilities, you don't need to go nuclear. That's why Russia has the low yield weapons. They don't necessarily have the conventional capabilities to match the US. And if we see, for example, conflict in Pakistan and India, Pakistan has a similar sort of like, they have a low yield stockpile because they've said we will go nuclear if we need to for battlefield reasons, because they cannot conventionally match India. And India says, no, we are going to have an exclusively second strike. We don't want to have this temptation to basically match nuclear for nuclear all of it. So I will say, I do think that those low yield weapons in Europe are very risky to have. I'll also say that I do think that there are political things we haven't talked a whole lot about here, but ensuring that Russia has a way to save face and still step out is probably going to be critical for ending the conflict. There's many ways that could happen, and it'll probably change as the conflict continues to change, right? We can't necessarily roll back the clock and offer a deal that was offered previously. But whatever deal Russia is going to take, they would almost certainly have to have some way to be able to present it in like a face-saving way. So that kind of has to be kept in mind. It can't just be smash them and say, okay, well, we've killed you now. You need to accept it. Well, Russia can continue to keep pushing forward and maybe manipulate or change its aims if it needs to. But it's Putin and the rest of the oligarchs are not going to want to take a deal that looks bad at home.
All right. Well, we are with that out of time. I want to say I think it is something we can agree on here that the credibility has trade-offs. There's a general kind of idea in U.S. foreign policy, I think, that you want all the credibility you can get for your alliance commitments. And I think that the sort of scholarly view emerging here is that, well, maybe, you should at least think about it as a double-edged sword in some ways, because the things you do to make the threats credible might have some dangerous side effects or possible negative implications. So we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for doing 33% more than expected in this panel, and appreciate your time. And this will be on YouTube for posterity. So good luck. Bye.